The park was peaceful. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sound of children playing echoed from a distance. People walked along the pathways, enjoying the sun, lost in their own thoughts. James Walker walked slowly, blending into the crowd. He didn't rush. He didn't try to stand out. He was just another person in the park, just another face in a sea of strangers. But there was something about James. It wasn't obvious at first glance. No, it wasn't the way he dressed or the way he carried himself. It was something deeper. Something hidden beneath the surface. People who passed him by might have thought he was just another guy, someone with no story, no importance. But they couldn't have been more wrong. James had a secret. It wasn't a secret that he had told anyone about. It wasn't something he carried with him openly. It was a secret so powerful that it could change everything. It was a secret that could ruin people's lives, bring down entire organizations, and turn the world upside down. But James didn't want to do that. He wasn't the kind of person who craved attention. For years, James had kept his secret locked away. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to show off his power. He didn't want people to look at him and see only his strength. No, he wanted them to see what was on the inside. The real him. And so, he walked through the park that afternoon as if he were just anyone. He passed by groups of people chatting and laughing, completely unnoticed. No one saw the man walking among them. They didn't know who he was or what he had inside him. James had learned a long time ago that being invisible could be an advantage. People didn't pay attention to the quiet ones. The ones who didn't make noise, didn't try to stand out. It was the loud ones who got all the attention. The show-offs. The ones who thought they were important. But James didn't care about that. He had learned that if you wanted to succeed in this world, sometimes it was better to stay out of the spotlight. Sometimes, being invisible was the best way to get things done. As James walked through the park, he noticed a group of police officers sitting near a bench, talking and laughing. They looked relaxed, maybe even a little too relaxed for people in their line of work. They were off duty, enjoying a rare moment of peace. But James had seen them before. He knew who they were. One officer stood up as James walked past. He had a confident smile on his face, the kind of smile that only someone who felt powerful would wear. "Hey, you," the officer called out. His voice was loud, filled with a sense of superiority. "What are you doing here?" James didn't flinch. He had learned long ago to ignore people like this. People who thought they were better than everyone else. But for some reason, that officer's voice made James pause. He turned slowly to face the officer. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a big grin plastered on his face. He wasn't threatening, not exactly. But there was a certain arrogance in the way he stood, the way he looked at James. As if James was beneath him, as if James didn't belong in the same space. James didn't say anything. He just stared at the officer, his face calm, his expression unreadable. He had been in situations like this before. People liked to make fun of him, to think they were better because of the way he looked or the way he dressed. It wasn't anything new. But today, something felt different. The officer, seeing that James wasn't going to respond, smirked. "What, you too good to talk to us?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Don't worry, we're not gonna bite." James didn't move. He didn't react. But his mind was already calculating. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew that sometimes it was better to just let people talk. Let them think they had the upper hand. Because one day, things would change. One day, they would realize they were wrong. The officer continued to laugh, but James didn't join in. He just turned and began to walk away. That's when it happened. The officer reached out and grabbed James by the arm, pulling him back. "Hey, "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his grip tightening. "I wasn't done talking to you." James could feel the officer's hand on his arm. He could feel the pressure, the power behind it. But he didn't react. He didn't show that it bothered him. Instead, he simply looked at the officer's hand and then back up at his face. "You should let go of me," James said, his voice calm but firm. The officer paused for a moment, taken aback by the way James spoke. But then he chuckled, thinking James was just trying to act tough. "What, you think you can tell me what to do?" he asked, his voice full of mockery. James didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. With a single movement, he stepped out of the officer's grip and walked away. The officer stood there for a moment, staring after him. He had expected James to fight back, to say something clever. But James hadn't said a word. He had just walked away, and that made the officer feel a little foolish. But that wasn't the end of it. James knew that the officer wasn't going to let it go that easily. People like him, who felt powerful and in control, didn't like being ignored. They didn't like feeling like they were nothing. And so, James knew that this wasn't the last time he would see this officer. In fact, he was about to find out just how right he was. As James walked further into the park, he could hear the officer behind him, calling to his friends. They were laughing, making jokes about him. But James didn't care. He didn't need to listen. He had learned long ago to ignore the noise. But just as he was about to round the corner, something unexpected happened. The officer caught up with him again, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had brought his friends along. The group of officers surrounded James, blocking his path. "Hey, we were just having a little fun earlier," one of the officers said, trying to sound friendly. "We didn't mean anything by it. But now you're making it awkward. Just let us have a little fun, all right?" James didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching them. He knew what they were doing. They were trying to get a reaction out of him. They wanted him to snap, to show that he wasn't as calm as he seemed. But James wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He had bigger things to worry about. One of the officers reached into his pocket and pulled out something shiny. James couldn't quite see what it was at first, but then he realized. It was a small chain bracelet, one of those cheap ones you could find at any store. The officer dangled it in front of James. "Here, take it," the officer said with a grin. "It'll match your vibe." James stared at the bracelet for a moment. He could feel the weight of the officer's words, the way they were trying to make him feel small. But again, he didn't react. Instead, he reached out and took the bracelet from the officer's hand. He didn't wear it, but he didn't throw it away either. He simply held it in his hand, his fingers wrapped around the cool metal. The officers laughed, thinking they had won. They thought they had broken him. But they didn't know James. He wasn't just some guy in the park. He wasn't some random person they could make fun of. He had a secret. A big secret. And one day, they would find out just who James Walker really was. James Walker continued walking through the park, his eyes scanning the path ahead, not really paying attention to much around him. He was used to the park's sights and sounds, the rustling of leaves in the trees, the laughter of children playing near the swings, the distant hum of voices in the distance. It was an ordinary afternoon, just like any other. He wasn't expecting anything to happen. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing unexpected moments your way when you least expect it. And that's when he noticed them. A group of police officers were sitting on a nearby bench, laughing and chatting like they had nothing to do. Their uniforms were relaxed, their caps off, their faces full of ease. They were clearly off duty, enjoying a break from their daily work. The sunlight danced across their faces, and their conversations, though light, carried an air of confidence, maybe even too much confidence. James didn't mind the sight of them at first. It wasn't unusual to see police officers in public spaces, especially on a nice day when they had time off. They were just like anyone else, he thought. But as he drew closer, he felt their eyes on him. And that's when he knew they had noticed him. James was used to people looking at him. He was used to the subtle glances, the occasional double take, the judgment from strangers. He couldn't say he was surprised. He knew how people saw him, a tall man with a calm demeanor, dressed in a simple hoodie and faded jeans, carrying himself with quiet confidence. To some, it was easy to make assumptions. They saw the way he dressed. They saw his calm, quiet nature. To them, he probably seemed like an easy target. Maybe they thought he was a bit of an outsider, a man who didn't fit in with the crowd, a man who wouldn't stand up for himself. But James wasn't one to fight or argue. He knew that most people made snap judgments based on appearances. He didn't care what they thought. He just wanted to get through his day and keep to himself. So, he kept walking. But as he passed the group of officers, one of them called out to him. "Hey, buddy. You looking for trouble?" The voice was loud, but not threatening. It wasn't the kind of voice that sent chills down your spine. It was more playful than anything else, as if the officer was joking. But James could hear the edge in the officer's words. It wasn't just a friendly hello. It wasn't just an innocent question. There was something more behind it. Something mocking. James didn't flinch. He didn't stop or turn around. He just kept walking, keeping his pace steady and his head held high. He had heard it all before. The teasing. The assumptions. The needling comments. He wasn't going to let it get to him. But the officers weren't used to being ignored. They weren't used to being brushed off like that. And so, they decided to make a game of it. One of the officers, a tall man with a thick beard and a wide grin, stood up and approached James. He seemed to be the one leading the charge. The others followed suit, their faces still lit up with smirks, their laughter filling the air. "Hey, come on, man. Don't ignore us," the officer said with a playful voice, his tone still light but a bit more insistent. "We're just trying to have some fun." James didn't say anything. He didn't even look at the officer. He just kept walking, his steps as steady as before, his eyes focused ahead. But the officer wasn't going to let him go that easily. As James walked by, the officer reached out, grabbed the sleeve of his hoodie, and gently pulled him back. It wasn't rough, but it was enough to get James' attention. "Come on," the officer said, "don't be like that. Have a little fun with us." James stopped. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He simply turned to face the officer. He looked him in the eyes, his expression calm and steady. "I'm not interested in your fun," James said quietly, his voice calm but firm. For a moment, the officer seemed surprised by James' response. He had expected something different, maybe a fight, maybe an angry outburst. But James was quiet, unmoving, and his words were simple. The officer's grin faltered for a moment. But then, with a shrug, he grinned again and said, all right. No need to get all serious. Just relax, okay?" He dropped his hand from James' sleeve and stepped back. But he wasn't done. With a smirk on his face, the officer pulled something out of his pocket. James couldn't see it clearly at first, but as the officer held it out in front of him, James saw what it was: a cheap, shiny bracelet. It was the kind of thing you could pick up at any corner store, something that cost only a few dollars. The officer dangled it in front of James' face, twirling it between his fingers. "Here," the officer said, still smiling. "Wear this. It'll match your vibe." The other officers laughed. Some of them cheered him on, egging him to take the bracelet, to wear it like some kind of joke. They weren't being mean, Not exactly. They weren't threatening him. It was more like they were just having a little fun at his expense. But James wasn't going to play along. He didn't need to. He didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He just reached out, took the bracelet from the officer's hand, and looked at it for a moment. The officers, thinking they had won, waited for James to react. They waited for him to laugh, to wear the bracelet, or at least to say something. They waited for him to be like everyone else they had made fun of. But James didn't laugh. He didn't say anything. He just held the bracelet in his hand. His fingers wrapped around it. And as he stood there, not showing any emotion, something inside him began to stir. This wasn't just a bracelet. This wasn't just some joke. No, this was about something bigger. It was about the way they saw him. The way they judged him based on how he looked. The way they thought they could just have a laugh at his expense, as if he was nothing more than a target. James didn't need to react. He didn't need to say anything. Because he knew something they didn't. He knew that one day, they would regret this. One day, they would find out who he really was. And when that day came, they would see how wrong they were. The officers, still smiling and laughing, watched James for a moment. But when he didn't react the way they expected, their smiles slowly faded. They exchanged uncertain glances. But James simply turned and began walking away, the bracelet still in his hand. The officers watched him go. They didn't know it then, but that was the moment things started to change. James wasn't just some random man in the park. He wasn't some guy they could laugh at. He had something they didn't see. And one day, they would learn that. As James Walker continued his walk through the park, the sound of the officers' laughter echoed in his ears. He heard their taunts, their playful jeers, but they didn't bother him. He'd grown used to moments like this. He knew exactly how people looked at him, the tall, quiet man who didn't make waves, who didn't fit in with the crowd. He wasn't what they expected, and that made him an easy target. But they didn't know what he was capable of. They had no idea what lay beneath the calm exterior. James slipped the bracelet into his pocket. He didn't need to wear it. It was just a cheap piece of jewelry, a simple trinket meant to mock him. But James wasn't someone who cared about appearances. He wasn't someone who needed validation from others. The bracelet wasn't the issue. It was what it represented, how quickly people judged him, how they assumed things about him based on the way he looked. The officers didn't realize the gravity of their actions. To them, it was just a game, just some harmless fun. But to James, it was another reminder of how easy it was for others to underestimate him. And they weren't the first. People had always treated him this way. It was as if they saw him, but didn't really see him. They saw a man who didn't speak much, who didn't make a fuss, and they thought that meant he didn't matter. They thought that meant they could do whatever they wanted with him. James had spent years keeping his true self hidden. It wasn't out of fear or insecurity. It was simply because he understood something that the world didn't. Sometimes, it's better to stay in the background. Sometimes, it's better to let people think they know you, to let them make their judgments. Because in time, when the world finally wakes up, you're in a position to change everything. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know that James had a history, one that went beyond their petty jokes. He wasn't just some guy in the park, some stranger they could pick on. He was a man who had learned to wait, to observe, to bide his time. And one day, when the moment was right, he would make them see him for who he really was. But that day wasn't today. Today, he would walk away. Today, he would let them laugh, let them think they had won. For now, he would simply disappear into the crowd, as he always did. The officers didn't stop their teasing. As James walked away, they continued to joke among themselves, still laughing at what they thought was a harmless prank. But there was a slight shift in the air, a subtle change in the energy around them. They hadn't expected James to just walk away. They hadn't expected him to ignore them so completely. And though they didn't say it out loud, a small part of them began to wonder why. One of the officers, a man named Mark, looked after James for a moment. He had been part of the group, part of the laughter. But something about the way James had handled the situation left him with an uncomfortable feeling. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something about that man that didn't sit right. "Hey," Mark said to his partner, Steve. "Did you notice how that guy just walked away? Like, nothing even happened." Steve, who had been enjoying the jokes just as much as the others, shrugged. "He was just some guy, man. Who cares?" Mark wasn't so sure. He felt like there was something more to James, something he hadn't seen. But before he could dwell on it further, another officer, a young woman named Jessica, broke into the conversation. "Forget about him," she said with a smirk. "He probably didn't even know what hit him. I bet he's too scared to say anything." But Mark didn't find it so funny. There was a nagging feeling in his chest that he couldn't shake. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was just his imagination, but something about the way James had handled the situation made him uneasy. He shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling. "Yeah, maybe. But there was something different about that guy. I don't know." He didn't flinch at all. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "You're overthinking it, Mark. He's just a guy. Nothing more." But Mark wasn't convinced. There was something there, something in the way James had stood there, silent and unbothered. It wasn't the reaction of someone who had been intimidated. It was the reaction of someone who had seen it all before, who had learned to keep their cool no matter what. And that made Mark feel even more unsettled. James didn't think about the officers as he walked away. His thoughts were already drifting elsewhere, his mind focusing on the bigger picture. He had come to the park for a reason, after all. The officer's little prank was just a distraction, a momentary annoyance. No, James had more important things to think about. He had a plan. A plan that had been years in the making. And while the officers had been laughing, James had been quietly observing. He'd watched the way they interacted with each other, the way they carried themselves. He'd seen the signs, the subtle gestures, the way they spoke, the way they assumed their power over others. He'd seen enough to know that this group of officers was just another example of what he had encountered time and time again, people who thought they were untouchable. But that was the thing about people who thought they were untouchable: they never saw it coming when everything they knew was about to change. As James walked down the path, he couldn't help but think about the bracelet in his pocket. It was a small thing, insignificant on its own. But in his hands, it was a symbol. It was a reminder of how the world saw him, how people always saw him. James didn't mind being underestimated. In fact, he preferred it. Because when people underestimate you, they let their guard down. They let you slip through the cracks. And when the time comes, you can rise up and show them exactly who you are. James wasn't just some guy in the park. He wasn't just a man who took insults and walked away. He had power. Power that no one knew about, power that he had kept hidden for so long. And one day, that power would be revealed. One day, the officers who had laughed at him would see the true extent of it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, James stopped by a bench and sat down, pulling the bracelet from his pocket. He stared at it for a moment, the light catching on its shiny surface. It was still just a cheap piece of jewelry, something that had been meant as a joke. But to James, it represented something much larger. It was a symbol of the way the world had treated him. A world that had always seen him as less than, a world that had never bothered to look beyond the surface. But that would change. And the officers? They wouldn't know what hit them. The day had finally arrived. It had been building up quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The officers, so confident in their own power, had no idea what was about to hit them. They had no idea that the man they had mocked in the park was about to turn their world upside down. Later that week, the precinct was buzzing with the usual noise. Officers moved back and forth, exchanging stories of the latest cases, talking about their plans for the weekend, and generally enjoying the camaraderie that comes with the job. It was just another normal day for them. They didn't know that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't even imagine. In the midst of this, they were called into an urgent meeting. The order had come from higher up, but no one had bothered to explain exactly what the meeting was about. There was no indication of anything unusual, just a routine summons. So, they filed into the meeting room, the air filled with casual chatter and a sense of mild curiosity. But then, the door opened. All noise stopped. Standing in the doorway was James Walker. But this was not the same man they had seen in the park. Gone was the hoodie and faded jeans. Gone was the quiet, unassuming man they had so easily dismissed. Instead, James stepped into the room wearing a perfectly tailored suit, one that spoke of power, authority, and sophistication. The officers froze. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. James didn't look like someone who had been the subject of their jokes. He didn't look like someone they could push around. He looked different. Stronger. More confident. More powerful. The officers exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. And then, James spoke. "Surprised to see me here." His voice was calm, but there was a strength to it, a weight that made every word stand out. The officer who had put the bracelet on James in the park, Mark, opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at James, his mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening. But he couldn't. The man in front of him didn't make sense. He had seen James just a few days ago, just another man in the park, someone to mock and make fun of. But now, James was standing in front of him with a look of calm authority, and Mark couldn't help but feel small. "I think it's time you all learned who I really am," James continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm not the man you made fun of in the park. I'm your superior. I'm the one who signs your paychecks." The words hung in the air, sinking into the officers like a stone dropping into water. For a moment, no one moved. No one could move. The room was frozen in shock. The man they had laughed at, the man they had assumed was nothing more than a nobody, was in fact the most important person in their entire department. James wasn't just some random guy. He wasn't just an unimportant figure. He was their boss. He had been watching them closely. Every joke, every sneer, every dismissive glance, they had all been seen by James. And now, it was time for them to face the consequences. The officers looked at each other, their faces pale with realization. Mark was the first to speak, though his voice was small and shaky. You're our boss?" he asked, disbelief coloring his words. James nodded slowly. "Yes, I am," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room, making each officer feel the weight of his words. "I've been in charge of this department for a while now. I've been watching all of you. And I've seen how you've treated people, how you treat people who are different from you. It's time for that to change." The room remained silent. The officers stood motionless, the shock of the moment settling in. They had underestimated James. They had laughed at him, made jokes at his expense, all while failing to see the man behind the quiet exterior. They had failed to recognize the power he held. James didn't look angry. He didn't look upset. He simply looked disappointed. He was calm, but there was a depth to his presence that made it clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with. "I know what you're thinking," James continued. "You're wondering how this could be. You're wondering how someone like me could be in charge. But the truth is, I've been watching all of you for a long time. And now, it's time for you to understand something: respect is not something you demand. It's something you earn. And you earn it by how you treat others. The officers were still processing everything. They had no idea what to say, what to do. They had never imagined anything like this could happen. They had been so sure of their power, so sure that they could control the situation. But now, the tables had turned. They were the ones who were powerless. Mark, the officer who had mocked James the most, took a step forward, his voice trembling. We didn't know," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "We didn't realize who you were. We thought. You thought you could treat me however you wanted." James interrupted, his voice firm but not cruel. "You thought you could mock me and make fun of me because of the way I looked? Because I didn't react the way you expected?" Mark opened his mouth to speak again, but James raised a hand to stop him. "No," James said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "It's not about what you thought. It's about what you did. And now, you will face the consequences of that." The officers stood there, stunned into silence. James didn't shout, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, exuding an undeniable authority that made it impossible for anyone to deny what he was saying. "For years," James continued, "I've watched this department, and I've watched all of you. I've seen how you treat people who are different. I've seen how you use your position of power to intimidate others, to make them feel small, to make them feel insignificant. But no more. It's time for a change." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The officers were too stunned to speak, too stunned to even move. They had no idea what was coming next, but they knew that things would never be the same again. "I'm here to make sure you understand something," James said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "You are in a position of power. You have the ability to make people's lives better, to protect and serve. But that power comes with a responsibility. And if you're not going to treat people with respect, if you're not going to uphold the values that this department stands for, then you won't be here much longer." The officers exchanged nervous glances. They could feel the weight of James' words. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. And they could tell that James was a man who always kept his promises. James stood in front of them, calm but unyielding. His eyes locked onto each officer in the room, ensuring they felt the weight of his words. This was more than a moment of personal redemption. It was about shifting the culture of the very place that had once belittled him, misjudged him, and treated him as invisible. They had assumed he was just another faceless person in the crowd, someone they could easily mock and dismiss. But they were wrong, so wrong. He wasn't just anyone. And now they would learn that lesson the hard way. Mark, the officer who had instigated the teasing, still couldn't seem to grasp the reality of the situation. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room, looking for anyone to confirm that this was just a bad joke. But no one responded. The other officers were equally stunned, their usual bravado nowhere to be found. James had shattered their illusions with one simple revelation. He could see it in their eyes. Fear. Confusion. Regret. But James wasn't there to gloat. He wasn't there to rub their mistake in their faces. No, his purpose was greater than that. This was about transformation, not revenge. "Do you understand now?" James asked, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. Mark opened his mouth to speak again, but this time, no words came out. He was at a loss. The air in the room seemed thick, oppressive. Every officer was frozen, unsure of how to react. What could they say? How could they respond to this reality that had just been thrust upon them? The man they had treated as inferior, as insignificant, was their superior in every sense of the word. He held power over them, and they knew it. James could sense their discomfort, their realization sinking in like lead. But he didn't want to dwell on their confusion or regret. That would do nothing to change the course of events. No, he wanted action. He wanted them to understand that respect wasn't a matter of who had the most power, it was about how you used it, how you treated others, no matter their status. You may have thought you were untouchable, James continued, his gaze steady. You may have thought you could get away with mocking someone, treating them like they didn't matter. But that's not how things work around here. Not anymore. The silence in the room was suffocating. James let his words hang in the air for a long moment, watching the officers as they absorbed the reality of the situation. This wasn't just about him. This was about their behavior, their attitudes, and the system they had built that allowed such actions to go unchecked. Finally, one of the other officers, a middle-aged man with a tired expression named Officer Hayes, cleared his throat. "James, we didn't know," he said slowly, his voice tentative. "We didn't understand who you were. We were just playing around. We didn't mean anything by it." James raised an eyebrow at him. "Didn't mean anything by it? How do you think I felt, being laughed at and mocked, just because I didn't fit your idea of what someone in power should look like? Did you think I didn't notice? Did you think I didn't hear you?" Hayes took a step back, visibly shrinking under James' gaze. He hadn't realized how deeply his words had cut. None of them had. It had seemed like harmless fun, a way to pass the time. But now, standing in front of James, they realized how misplaced their actions had been. James took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't angry, not anymore. This wasn't about anger. It was about educating them, showing them the right way. The hard way, perhaps, but the right way. "I'm not here to punish you," James said, his voice firm. "I'm here to help you understand. We all have a responsibility to each other. As officers, as members of this department, we are held to a higher standard. We are supposed to protect and serve, not mock, belittle, or humiliate." Mark shifted nervously, his eyes still avoiding James. "I didn't mean to," he started, but James cut him off. "Stop," James said, his tone sharp, commanding attention. "This is not about what you meant to do. It's about what you actually did. You mocked someone who hadn't done anything wrong. You assumed that just because I didn't respond the way you expected, I was weak. You assumed I was nothing." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. He could see the shame building on their faces, but that wasn't enough. He needed them to understand why this moment mattered, why their behavior had been unacceptable, and why change had to happen not just for him, but for everyone they interacted with in the future. "I've worked hard to get where I am," James continued, his voice steady, "and I didn't do it by making others feel small. I didn't get here by treating people like they were beneath me. I got here by showing respect, by doing my job well, and by never forgetting that the power we hold is a privilege, not a right." The room was still, every officer hanging on his every word. James' words were like a lesson, a reminder of what it truly meant to be part of something bigger than themselves. They had been blinded by their own sense of superiority, and now it was time for them to see beyond that. "You are in a position of trust," James continued. "And if you can't treat others with the respect they deserve, then maybe you shouldn't be in this department at all." The statement was bold, but it carried the weight of truth. There was no room for complacency, no space for people who didn't understand the responsibility that came with the uniform. If they couldn't see the importance of treating others with dignity, then they had no place serving the public. Mark finally spoke up, his voice full of remorse. I'm sorry," he muttered, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't think it would matter." James looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "You don't get to decide what matters. You don't get to decide who deserves respect. That's not how it works. The silence stretched on as Mark processed the weight of those words. He had never expected this. None of them had. They had thought they were above it all. But now, standing before James, they saw the error of their ways. And it was up to them to make it right. James stepped forward, moving to the front of the room where the department's leadership had been watching from a distance. The heads of the precinct, the chief and senior officers, had been observing this interaction closely. They, too, had been silent, allowing James to lead the conversation. It was clear to them now that James had earned his position in ways they hadn't fully appreciated before. James turned to face the leadership, his expression resolute. "This department needs to change," he said. "It's time to stop tolerating behavior that doesn't align with our values. If we want to be the best, we have to treat everyone with respect, no exceptions." The chief nodded slowly, clearly impressed by James' words. "We hear you," the chief said, his voice low but sincere. "We've all been too complacent. It's time for a change. We'll make sure this is addressed." James nodded once, his eyes scanning the room. He had done what he came here to do. He had spoken the truth, and now it was up to them to act. "I expect better from all of you," James concluded. "And I will be watching." As he turned and walked out of the room, the officers were left in stunned silence. They had just witnessed the most important lesson of their careers. They had learned the hard way that true power didn't come from bullying others or showing off. It came from humility, respect, and the understanding that no one was ever truly powerless. As James walked away from the meeting room, a sense of calmness washed over him. He had done what he needed to do. He had shown those officers that no one could get away with treating others with disrespect, especially when they didn't understand the real power behind someone. They had tried to humiliate him, make him feel small. But James had proven that true strength comes from within. It wasn't about the clothes you wore or the things people thought you lacked. It was about who you were, what you stood for, and how you treated others. The officers who had mocked him were now facing the consequences of their actions. They were put on administrative leave, pending an investigation. It was the right step, but it wasn't something James had asked for. He didn't want them to be punished for the sake of punishment. He wanted them to understand. And hopefully, they would. But the others around him, those who had seen what happened that day, would never forget. They had seen a man who had been underestimated, who had been made fun of, stand tall and show them all that power wasn't about how you appeared to the world. It was about the respect you earned and the strength you held inside. James wasn't out for revenge. He wasn't seeking to make anyone suffer. What he wanted was for the message to be clear: respect and dignity should never be based on appearances. The days that followed were filled with quiet whispers, conversations held behind closed doors. The officers who had mocked James had to answer for their actions. The investigation was underway, but it wasn't just a matter of discipline. The whole department was forced to face the bigger issue, the culture that allowed disrespect to exist in the first place. James' role in the department grew stronger after that day. He didn't just gain respect from his colleagues. He earned it. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. And now, people around him saw him for what he truly was: a leader, a person who knew the importance of respect and fairness. One afternoon, James sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was the chief of police. "James," the chief said, his voice serious but respectful, "I wanted to thank you. What you did, how you handled that situation, it was exactly what this department needed. We're going to be making some changes. Not just in terms of discipline, but in how we treat everyone, regardless of what they look like. It's time for a new approach." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was what he had been hoping for. Change. It wasn't enough for him to just prove that he deserved respect. He wanted to ensure that this wasn't a one-time lesson. He wanted it to be the beginning of something better, something bigger. We've decided, the chief continued, that we will be conducting a series of workshops and training sessions. It's time to address biases, to make sure that everyone in this department understands the importance of treating people with dignity and respect. And we want you to help lead it. James was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the chief's words sink in. He knew this was a big responsibility, but it was also an opportunity. It was a chance to change the department for the better, to ensure that no one else would ever have to face the kind of treatment he had experienced. "I'll do it," James said finally, his voice steady. "I'll help however I can." The chief's tone softened. "We trust you. We've seen what you're capable of." "Thank you, James. This is the beginning of something important." As James hung up the phone, he looked out of his office window, watching the city move below. He had made a difference. But he knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. In the days that followed, James worked closely with the department's leadership to develop a new program. They brought in experts to help with training, and James was right there, guiding the discussions, sharing his own experiences. He wanted to make sure that the officers who were being trained didn't just learn the right things to say but also how to genuinely shift their attitudes and behaviors. It wasn't enough to just teach them what not to do. They needed to understand why they needed to change. It wasn't an easy process. Some officers were resistant, but most understood the importance of what they were being taught. They saw the positive changes happening around them, and they began to reflect on their own actions. Slowly but surely, the department began to transform. Meanwhile, the officers who had mocked James were placed under investigation. They had to answer for their actions. It was clear that the department was committed to holding people accountable, no matter their rank. They had treated someone unfairly, and now they had to face the consequences of that. But James didn't take pleasure in their downfall. He wasn't happy to see them punished. He simply wanted them to learn, to understand that what they had done was wrong. He believed in redemption. If they were willing to change, then they could be better, just like everyone else. In the end, the officers received a range of consequences, from additional training to suspension. It wasn't about destroying their careers. It was about giving them a chance to grow and change, just like James had. As the weeks passed, the department became a better place. Officers began to treat each other and the public with more respect. They recognized the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not just for what they appeared to be. James had shown them that. But the real victory wasn't just in the department. It was in the community. James had worked hard not only to change the culture within the department but also to ensure that the public would feel safer and more respected by those who were supposed to serve and protect them. One day, James was walking through the precinct when a fellow officer, someone he hadn't interacted with much before, approached him. "James," the officer said, his voice respectful, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize I wasn't treating people the way I should have. I'm going to work on that." James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was what he had hoped for. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And sometimes, it started with just one person being brave enough to stand up for what was right. As the days turned into months, James continued to lead by example. He was no longer the quiet man in the background. He was someone people looked to for guidance, someone who had proven that true leadership came from the way you treated others. He had earned their respect, and they had learned that no one should ever be underestimated. In the end, James didn't just change the officers who had mocked him. He changed an entire department, an entire culture. And that, to him, was the greatest victory of all. As James stood before the group of officers and staff, The silence in the room was heavy with reflection. The tension that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a quiet respect that had grown throughout the course of the meeting. No one spoke for a few moments, as each person thought deeply about the lesson they had just witnessed. James looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new. He saw the looks of realization, the people who were now seeing the bigger picture. These were the same people who had once underestimated him, who had mocked him, and who had assumed he was just another face in the crowd. Now, they understood. Sometimes, James began, his voice steady but strong, the most powerful people don't need to scream. They don't need to fight. They let their actions speak for them. His words hung in the air, simple but profound. James wasn't boasting. He wasn't trying to make them feel small. Instead, he was reminding them of something very important, that power wasn't about volume. It wasn't about being loud or aggressive. True power came from within, from the way you carried yourself, the way you treated others, and the way you handled the challenges life threw your way. The officers and staff stood in silence, each person processing the lesson in their own way. Some were thinking about how they had treated others in the past, how they had made assumptions based on appearances. Others were reflecting on their own biases, on how easy it was to judge someone without understanding who they truly were. James had shown them all something they hadn't expected. They had thought they were the ones in control, that their badges and uniforms gave them authority over others. But James had shown them that true authority came not from a title, but from character. From being the kind of person who stood tall, even when no one was looking. From being the kind of person who did the right thing, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. James paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He could see the shift happening before him, the shift in the way people saw him, and the shift in the way they saw themselves. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, too. It was about the choices they made every day, the way they chose to treat others. Respect, James continued, his voice calm but firm, isn't something that is automatically given. It's something that is earned. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. His words struck a chord. It was true. James had been the quiet one, the one who had been overlooked and underestimated. But now, he stood before them, not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet strength that came from knowing who he was and what he stood for. He had earned their respect, not by force, but by showing them that he was more than what they had assumed him to be. As the silence stretched on, James gave them one last piece of advice. His voice softened, but the weight of his words was no less powerful. Next time, he said with a knowing smile, remember who you're dealing with before you decide to have some fun at someone's expense. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. A reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that no one should be judged based on how they looked, or what they wore, or where they came from. James had shown them that the true measure of a person wasn't in their outer appearance, but in the strength of their character, in the choices they made, and in the way they treated others. With those final words, James turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a room full of changed minds. The officers and staff, still standing in silence, were left to reflect on what had just happened. James hadn't just changed their perception of him, he had changed the way they would look at everyone moving forward. As he walked down the hallway, James felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them feel bad for what they had done. It was about teaching them a lesson that they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. It was about showing them that no one should ever be underestimated, and that respect should be given freely, without condition. In the days that followed, the effects of James' actions continued to ripple through the department. The officers who had once mocked him began to reflect on their behavior, and many of them started to make changes. They treated their colleagues with more respect, and they began to understand the importance of being kind and considerate, not just to those in power, but to everyone they encountered. It wasn't an overnight change, but it was a start. And for James, that was enough. The department also implemented new training programs focused on respect, empathy, and understanding. Officers were taught to recognize their own biases and to approach their work with a greater sense of fairness and equality. James was asked to lead some of the sessions, and he did so with the same calm strength he had shown that day in the meeting room. He knew that change wouldn't happen instantly, but he was willing to be a part of it. He wanted to make sure that the lesson he had taught was not forgotten. As time went on, James continued to lead with integrity and humility. He didn't seek out praise or recognition. He simply did his job, knowing that by doing so, he was helping to create a better, more respectful environment for everyone. And in the end, that was all that mattered to him. James had shown that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to remain calm, stand tall, and let your actions speak for themselves. He had proven that respect isn't something that can be demanded or forced. It's something that must be earned, and it's earned through actions, not words. As he sat at his desk one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, James smiled to himself. He had done more than change the department. He had changed the way people thought, the way they saw each other, and the way they saw themselves. And that, to him, was the greatest accomplishment of all. It wasn't about being the loudest. It wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the person who did what was right, even when no one was watching. It was about being the person who led with kindness, respect, and dignity. And in the end, that was all that mattered. James Walker had proven that sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And that was a lesson that no one would ever forget.